Guys, welcome back to Reaper Reel. If you're enjoying the content so far, if you could please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to get a few more. And now we're working more through the How to Survive Camping story series. This one is titled How to Survive Camping, Rule number 3, the lights. I run a private campground. I have a set of rules to ensure my campers have a safe and enjoyable vacation. My staff takes care of what threats we are capable of handling, but I do ask for modicum of common sense from my campers, such as not blundering off into the woods after an oversized firefly. This should be obvious. Anyone who has ever paid attention to anything should have heard the folklore by now. Will-o-wisps, marsh lights, fairy fire, whatever you call them. You should know they lead travellers astray, sometimes to their deaths. And yet, that's rule number 3 on my list. Don't follow the lights. Why they didn't have Gollum do an eye roll after pulling Frodo out of the swamp when the dumbass followed the lights, I'll never know. Real missed opportunity there. There aren't a lot of terrain hazards in my campground. No lakes to drown in, though there is one in the neighbouring area, but that's not old land, and the lights don't go further than the property line. No cliffs to blunder off. A steep hill that could result in a broken ankle, I suppose, but that's about it. Not like the Middle Ages either, where getting lost in the woods could leave you walking for days before you get out. As long as you walk in a relatively straight line, you'll find something man-made to lead you back to civilization. I've had many campers call the camp emergency line, asking for a ride back to camp after they wound up on the side of a nearby country road. Before cell phones, they had to hitchhike, and we lost a couple of people that way. That's a story for another day. The real hazard of the lights, and the only reason they merit a mention on my list, is because they leave people vulnerable to other designs of my campground. This is only partially about the lights. It's more about how I met the thing in the dark. It was the summer. We renovated the barn. It's the biggest structure on our property, with a high ceiling and intermittent support poles to hold up the vast open space. Initially, my father had hoped to make it into a show ring for horses. But after the whole cannibalism incident, he decided perhaps that wasn't a good idea. It became a meeting space instead for our various events, to use as an indoor area when it rained and they couldn't use a field. The acoustics were terrible, however, and our events weren't utilizing of this. My mother and father often argued about doing something different with it, but my father's heart was set on that horse ring. I waited quietly a few years before finally let go of my father's dream. It was part of grieving, I think. I remember standing in front of the barn and being unreasonably angry that they'd never done anything with the space, and now I was stuck with a useless barn that could go to much better use. And as I stood there, fuming, hating my father for his stupid, unreasonable dreams, I think I realised I was more angry at the fact he'd gone out into the darkness and let the beast kill him. Because that's what he did. He went out there to die and left me without my parents. I couldn't undo that. I wasn't certain if I'd stop being angry. However, the camp was mine now, and I couldn't hold on to things exactly as they were forever. It wouldn't bring them back. The next day, I started calling in contractors to make estimates. We'd clean up the vehicle garage and use it as indoor meeting space. It was a little smaller than the barn, but would suit the events needs just fine. The acoustics were still terrible, but at least sound wouldn't have to travel as far. We could construct a smaller garage for vehicles. We were only using a fraction of that space. The barn would be a camp store and a restaurant, I decided. That was what my mother wanted. Not a fancy restaurant, things like hot dogs and grilled cheese sandwiches. I was losing so much revenue to the food trucks during our large events. I thought at the time that I was getting a handle on running the campground. I was going to make some renovations, start some new cash streams, and perhaps this was going to work out. I knew what I was doing. I could do just fine for myself, even with this being an old land. I got complacent. I didn't notice the mound of leaves and broken branches was growing bigger out in the woods. It's been there for almost a decade, and perhaps it grew, but it was so slow I didn't realise. I thought it was just an oddity in how the forest debris accumulate, and it wasn't in the way, so I left it alone. A year, it grew 2 feet, and 2 feet the next year, and 2 feet more before I finally stopped. I should have realised that something was changing, and in old land, that meant something dangerous was happening. It was 2 in the morning when I was woken by the radio I keep on my nightstand. This was while cell phones were still quite new, and not everyone had one. Those that did couldn't get reception down in the woods. My staff patrolled the campground once an hour, 24/7, and campers knew they could flag them down for help. That is exactly what happened. Someone was missing. My staff member said they'd seen something in the woods and wandered off to go see what it was. And their campmates didn't think much of it until someone got up to pee that night and realised their tent flap was open and they hadn't came back. Did they follow the lights? I sighed, fumbling for my switch. Probably. I'll help look. If we don't find them in an hour, I'll call in more staff. Which would mean overtime pay. It couldn't be helped. I dressed quickly, and the little girl outside the window heard me moving around, and her crying stopped. She hiccuped twice. The only time I cannot leave the house is when the beast is present, and unless something unusual happens, such as the night my parents died, it only appears in the hour before dawn. The little girl is certainly a threat, but she is bound by certain rules. She can only enter through formal entry points, and can only harm my family if we leave by those same formal points. Garages don't count. They especially don't count if I'm already on a four-wheeler and I floor the gas as soon as the garage door opens. I glanced back at the house once I was past the edge of the driveway. The little girl stood at the fence, her hands on the pickets, watching me leave. I met my staff member at the last spot the missing camper was seen. It's a woman, he said, which is why their campmate was so concerned. Their fear was understandable, but they were worried about the wrong thing. There were non-human predators in these campgrounds, and they zealously protect their territory from lesser predators. Of course, they wouldn't pass up on an easy meal either. I wasn't worried. Most of the creatures at this point of time required some sort of trigger, such as the dancers or the man with the skull cup. The ones that actively hunted we could typically locate and dispose of before anyone was hurt. I remember this summer not only because we were remodeling the barn, but also because the nature of the campground started to change. It was inevitable, I suppose. The only way to stop it would be to sell it to someone outside the family, and then the creatures would slink away into the forest. Diminished, the trees would appear sparse. The imperfections would stand out more. The outside world would press in harder, and we would lose that sense of sincere isolation that my campers come here for. I left my vehicle behind on the road and went in on foot, carrying an electric lantern. I'm not afraid of the forest at night. My parents took me out after sunrise so that I would learn its way and grow up to respect the woods. The night quickly swallowed me up, so that I walked in a bubble of light cast by my lantern, trees appearing out of the darkness like looming sentinels, quickly vanishing behind me as I pressed on. I wasn't walking in any particular direction. I was looking for the lights. It took perhaps half an hour before I saw them. They hovered just overhead, neon green orbs, about the size of a soccer ball, motionless in midair, perhaps mere yards away. I knew this was to be a trick. I could never reach them. They would remain forever out of my grasp, seemingly not moving, but steadily leading me further and further into the woods. And I'd eventually come out near the highway. I didn't know. Like I said, there was not a lot of terrain hazards on the campground. I angled slightly to the right of them. Instead, there's a trick to it. Search near where the lights are first, but avoid following them. If the missing campers had tripped over branches and sprained their ankles, she'd hear me. Otherwise, I'd have to assume she'd just kept walking and would hitchhike her way back to the camp on her own. That could be a danger of its own. The odds were greatly in her favour at least. The locals around here are nice. I called her name as I walked. Her campmate had given it to my staff. It didn't take long before someone answered, frantically crying that, yes, here. She was here. Her voice was hoarse. I wondered how long she'd been here on her own. screaming for help. The florist had swallowed her up. Sound unless people were actively listening. Another quirk of an old land. She was buried in the ground to her waist. I paused, staring down at her in surprise. The earth around her was packed down, and her frantic crawling in dirt had produced thin scratch marks. Her fingers were bleeding, and her face was covered in tears and snot. I crouched in front of her and pulled a handkerchief out of my pocket to give her. "I'll have to call my staff to dig you out," I said. "It'll be okay. You followed the lights, didn't you?" She nodded gloomily. "Are they actually?" she whimpered. "Yes," I confirmed. "They are willow wasps. This whole burying thing is new, though. I guess they got tired of merely leading people out of the property line." Perhaps I shouldn't have told her that, for her breathing sped up. On the verge of hysteria, I opened my mouth to reassure her that everything would be fine, that willow wasps are generally harmless. And the lantern went out. All light went out. I froze. I could feel my heart speeding up as a sudden cold shiver of dread down the back of my neck was definitely new, and such I didn't know what to do. There's a few options when confronted with a supernatural creature you can't identify. Running is generally a poor choice. Predators are designed to outpace their prey. After all, hiding is similarly useless. Confronting the creature directly sometimes works, so long as you are respectful and they're the sort that you're willing to talk or bargain, such as the man with the skull cap. For everything else, groveling is the way to go. I dropped to my knees, grabbed the woman's hands, told her to lower her head and close her eyes, and keep them closed, no matter what she heard or felt. Become nothing, become like the dust of the ground, beneath notice, and perhaps whatever presence was approaching would pass us by. It was like the weight on my back. The very air was growing thick, and it slumped to the ground, dragging me with it. I struggled to breathe and heard the woman in front of me gasping, shaking violently with terror. There was a faint touch against the back of my head. Something immense, I realized, but so very in control that it could touch me as light as a fly. I struggled to remain still, burying my own trembling deep inside me, where it twisted around my chest and stomach. And since we had no escape, it noticed. I went to the next stage of groveling, begging. Look, sometimes you just have to throw your pride out the window and do whatever it takes to survive. I'm sorry, I gibbered. I was just trying to help her. Please, I beg you, pass us by. I felt pressure against my back, like a lead blanket weighing me down and pressing my body into the ground. I cowered in the dirt, holding on tight to the wrists of the buried camper, whimpering in the back of my throat. I think she opened her eyes. I think that's what happened. She began screaming over and over and over, a high, raw scream of mindless terror, pausing only to fill her lungs, and then it started over again, a rumble like stones rolling downhill, and the earth around me shifted, loosened, and I felt my body slide backwards, my throat constricted with fear. I thought for an instant The earth was going to swallow me up like it had swallowed her, but I did not dare open my eyes. My body was pelted with debris, small sticks and stones. The very earth around me torn up and thrown into the air, spun around me in a whirlwind that howled in my ears like a beast that stole away the woman's screams. I covered my face with my arms as pain slashed across my exposed skin, and I felt hot blood trickle down the back of my hands. My body was curled tight in a ball on the ground, bucked and rippled beneath me. I heard agonizing groan of the trees as they shifted in the frenzied wind. I kept my eyes firmly shut. Then it ended. The wind vanished, the weight shifted, and everything was silent. I remained exactly as I was, arms over my face, eyes shut tight, until I heard a cricket resume chirping from somewhere nearby. Only then did I open my eyes. My lantern lay nearby, casting its light again. Covered in a thin layer of dirt, the ground around me had been stripped clear of leaves and debris, leaving behind a 5-foot diameter circle. The dirt swept in grooves that spun outwards in a spiral. There was no sign of the woman or the hole she'd been trapped in. I returned to the road and radioed the rest of my staff that were working that night and told them that we were missing a camper, and I didn't think we'd be finding her alive. They were to keep an eye out for her body, but they were not to leave the road, not until morning, and the lights abruptly stopped working. Drop to the ground and keep your eyes shut. The police were there the next morning to talk to the affected campsite and take down a missing persons report. I filled out the paperwork mechanically, exhausted from the evening spent in the library, digging through volume upon volume in search of an explanation for what had happened. I found nothing, and my nerves were worn thin. The many cups of coffee and the steadily wailing of the little girl just outside the window. It's no use yelling her to shut up. She only cries louder. It took a few more encounters and subsequent disappearances before I put together the pattern. The light vanishing, the sensation of something immense passing by, the whirlwind that takes away anyone that looks at the creature, the dreams everyone has of dying in a way they fear most. Finally, I realized that the pile of debris in the wood was growing rapidly, and I went to investigate and found that I recognized the feel of the presence that dwelt inside. It spoke to me. I do not remember what it said. I only knew what I had to write down in the rules when I returned to my office. I also added rule number 3. I put it high up on the list because it's one of the more common hazards that people will encounter. There isn't actually a system to how I organise the rules. It's, however, I feel about it at the time when adding a new one. Anyway, I'll make this last bit short because my elder brother just stuck his head in and says that Turtle is sprinting across the field with what might be an empty bag of lemon drops, chased by a horde of rabbits. I think it'll be okay, but Brian wants to release his dogs, and I'm not sure the situation merits that kind of massacre yet. I should go make sure no one does anything dumb. I'm a campground manager. I'm trying to keep the place safe. Please, for the love of my sanity, rub a couple of brain cells together when you're out in the woods and don't follow the lights. Thanks, guys. That's another installment of How to Survive Camping. And I will be away from my computer for the next few weeks, so uploads won't be as frequent as you probably can tell. And if you are enjoying the content, please like and subscribe to the channel and comment about which stories you're enjoying most. Thank you. The police were there the next morning to talk to the affected campsite and take down a missing